For the moment, we will move on still with design, and Jeremy Meyerson, who does wear shoes, but is equally inspirational. And yes, he is there. So, Jeremy, you don't have to show us your feet. Thank you. I will pass it on.
Okay. So can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
That's great. Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm probably going to repeat some of the themes that have just been developed over the course of this day, but I'm going to be doing it from a design perspective, and I'm very pleased to be the first speaker in a session called Design for Life, because I think that it's really important that older people, and where they're aging in place, they should have years full of life and not life full of years. And design can be a big determinant in improving quality of life later on. Just by way of introduction, I'm the Helen Hamlin Chair of Design at the Royal College of Art. We started off as a single issue research centre 30 years ago, looking at the needs of an ageing population, and an ageing society is very, very critical to all the work that we do, although we're more broadly based now looking at inclusive design. And so I've been asked to make a few reflections on what might go into an ISO Aging Society standard. And I think the first point to make is that we shouldn't think that older people are necessarily going to be moving into specialist housing or retirement villages or custom-made facilities. Most people are aging in place as they get older. And I've just done an exhibition that's on at the Pratt Institute in New York. It's temporarily closed, but it's going to reopen in the summer. It's called New Old. And the data there is that 96% of Americans are actually aging in place, half of them in the suburbs, a quarter of them in rural areas. And so people have got to make do and adapt and retrofit, in many cases, existing homes and neighbourhoods. And I think that's a very important point to make. I just want to throw in 4 words that I think encapsulate very briefly what I want to say. And you've probably heard these words in different guises earlier in the day. They are inclusive, livable, scalable, and respectful. And they're words that interrelate and have connections with each other. So if we're going to have housing and neighbourhoods which are inclusive, I think we need a way to measure that. I think we need to build standards around having a position in which we want social inclusion and not design for special needs. And one of the problems in the design industry around catering for aging is that historically we've had a medical model of aging, and we've seen aging as a special needs target group, and we do something different for them. And I think in the COVID crisis, where in the UK over 70s were told to just stay indoors as a homogenous mass, just completely sidelined and told to be isolated, it shows the dangers of this idea of special needs design. I think we need to have inclusive design, and above all, we need to have intergenerational design, in that older age groups can mix freely and easily, and there will be features in the home and the neighbourhood that will allow intergenerational mixing. And that might be as simple as looking at a local neighbourhood and creating local accessible design features. And a lot of work in design research has been about adaptive fits, seats, lights, adjustments to walkways and pavements. These kinds of things can make a huge difference to making your neighbourhood and housing inclusive. So the inclusive angle needs to go in the guidelines. The second point is livable, and there's a huge amount of talk and excitement around technology and what new digital systems and services can do. And I think that we need to look at housing in relation to the digital layer that we can put on it. But we need to be aware that most people want human interaction. I ran a Mori poll a few years ago in which we asked people whether they wanted to be cared for by robots or humans in old age. 75%, which I thought was quite low, said humans. 25% said robots. And amongst a younger age group, up to a third wanted robots to look after them. But we do understand that loneliness is the epidemic of the 21st century. And we really need to be aware that we want our environments not completely automated. We want a livable element. Which brings me to the issue of scalable. And I know that Nick from the National Innovation Centre for Aging at Newcastle University was just talking very eloquently about scalability in care. The idea of scalability is very important in the design context. And there has been this tension between things that are translatable and will be, whether they're products or services or building components or architectural layouts, they tend to be local and very specific to their communities and cultures. But we do need to learn, and we need to share that learning globally. And I feel that we need to scale up where possible. So I think that some element where good practice can be repeated, componentry can be scaled, I think that's a very important element. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I think that housing for older people and neighbourhoods needs to be respectful. If we are going to harvest data, if we are going to have sensors and cameras, we need to respect data privacy. Similarly, we need to respect human privacy, the need for people to have their own private space and then to be able to enjoy company when they want it. So much housing for older people has just one bedroom, when actually they would like two, so somebody can go into their private space and visit them. So we need to be respectful for people's abilities as they age, the minor medical impairments of aging, and we need to build an inclusive, scalable, livable environment in which to do it. And I just want to finish with a quote from a London research team, and they were asked to give some recommendations a few years ago to the WHO on age-friendly neighbourhoods. And they said, neighbourhood is a goal to be achieved rather than a starting point. And I think that's a very good way of putting it. If you want really successful neighbourhoods, you've got to put the building blocks in place. And design is essential to help you do that. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Jeremy. I have come to expect. Thank you very much. And to book you for Tama Duffy Day, who's a principal at Gensler. She, I would imagine, would agree that neighbourhoods are a goal rather than the starting point. I like that expression. Tama, would you like to make yourself known? I'm not going to give you a big... you're here, great. Fire away. Thank you, Jeremy. Please stay around.
Great, thank you, Ian. I'm dialing in from Washington, D.C., and my day job is leading the health and wellness practice at Gensler, but my night job of late has really been sewing masks for all the seniors in our communities. And as you've heard throughout the day, what one of us learns and shares has the potential to benefit all of us. And if we've learned nothing else during this pandemic, it's that across the globe we are connected in meaningful, powerful ways that often go unnoticed. For designers of space, this concept is familiar. We seek to create a better world through design at Gensler, but we know that the effects of places and spaces often play out on an unconscious level. In isolated communities and social determinants of health were concepts and concerns that fuel Boomtown, a Gensler research project that grew into a framework focusing on how to design for today's aging population. Our thesis, that the desire for authentic, productive, and interconnected lifestyles transcends all generations directly aligns with the Agile Aging Alliance's Neighborhood of the Future research and drove the initial connections between our two groups. For me, portions of this conversation today really began back in December in London at your leadership roundtable with AARP and the German Marshall Fund. We believe Boomtown is a new community model for all ages, and our goal is to implement transformative solutions for all people within existing and new urban communities. As illustrated in this diagram, Boomtown is successful when looking at the combined focus areas of physical and social architecture with economics and policy. In the next slides, I'll give 3 quick examples of how the 6 lenses that you see here noted in blue have been used across the world to move the needle towards designing intergenerational communities. We've literally tested the Boomtown framework in 2 locations. You might recognize this image as it's been the visual cover for this event today. This is Ivy City in Northeast Washington, D.C. This area has small residential houses to the right and larger industrial buildings to the left. Through mixed-use development, we would seek to soften and engage the industrial buildings while revitalizing existing residential areas with green pocket parks. In many ways, stitching the two together in meaningful ways that benefit all. In this specific community, hubs would need to be created for creative work environments, healthcare, affordable living, and education, and portions of this concept are being adapted. Through the framework of smart development, a warehouse has been converted into apartments with distilleries, restaurants, and retail at the base. Additionally, a large stage for local bands now occupies a portion of the roof. In Mom's Organic Market, a much-needed source for healthy food is prominently located between the industrial hub and the existing residences. By providing purpose-centered programs, our second lens, the community has seen a decline in violence and an increase in age diversity among the residents. And Jeremy, speaking of robots, our new reality during the pandemic means that we are witnessing some interesting and fast-moving developments. In Hong Kong, where 1 in 3 residents will be 65 or older in 25 short years, robots are assisting seniors in retirement homes, underscoring the importance of the lens of evolving technology within their framework. Alongside these new possibilities, more timeless questions persist and at all scales. Our current research in Hong Kong has focused on housing, especially the challenges around the effect of Hong Kong's density on livability and affordability for seniors. To understand this density, at least 6 people live per meter in Hong Kong, literally on top of each other. And to translate that to New York City density, each New Yorker lives in 50 square meters, 50. The density in Hong Kong is really challenging to comprehend. So not surprisingly, the density is having an adverse effect on seniors due to demographic shifts, real estate premiums, and space constraints. Our first steps included the better integration of housing and services, and at a micro level, to look at the design of public housing's single occupancy unit. Through the framework lens of design conscious, we are seeking to integrate barrier-free accessibility, spatial connectivity, and functionality, really balancing environmental press. We are also integrating our Boomwork framework throughout China, the country with the world's largest population of older people. We're accomplishing this by emphasizing outdoor gathering spaces, extending transportation hubs, and integrating affordable housing. The Boomtown framework has allowed us to be more intentional in how we lead our project work. It also allows for more of our colleagues to incorporate the framework, to test it locally and report back on their own learnings. A byproduct of the ISO standards could be the integration of these elements into our global urban planning practice. At Taihu, a mixed-use development for a new district west of Shanghai, the community will integrate small residential enclaves with courtyards, recreational gardens, and greenery. Public health is promoted through urban planning and architectural design strategies, but also through social and economic means. The development has plans to be a healthcare destination, a recreation and holistic medicine destination, and a location to live long, healthy lives, illustrating the last two lenses of wellness-focused and mixed-use convenience. In 2017, Gensler launched our Experience Index, quantifying the X factor of design. To expand this further and focus on the human experience in cities, we are developing a City Design Index. The index will use original research and feedback from residents in cities around the world on how cities perform on a variety of socioeconomic factors. Hoping to launch next year, we'll be looking at diversity and demographics to offer generational data. Intergenerational social structures are key to our vision. Boomtown, our prototype community, seeks to grow a future where both people and property are integrated. To close, in at least 6 states in the United States, over half of the fatalities of COVID-19 have been linked to seniors in long-term care facilities. These facilities are just now getting personal protective equipment and testing. As Stephanie has also noted, they've been segregated, forgotten, and unsupported by social norms and health policy. When scaling our work and the ISO standard, it's critical to look at physical architecture, social architecture, economics, and policy together. Through this framework and in our solutions, seniors would be supported equally, living authentic, productive, and interconnected lives. We are very interested in continuing our engagement, in sharing research learning, and are excited to be engaged in this conversation. And a quick shout out to my colleague Laura Latham from the Gensler Research Institute for her leadership in this research. And thank you so very much, Ian, for engaging Gensler in this production.
I wasn't quick enough there. Thank you very much, Tama. Fascinating, and to see the actual work that you're doing is inspirational on so many levels. And yeah, we're looking forward to true collaboration. As I've said previously, the intent behind this work is not theoretical. The idea of looking at a standards framework that is aligned with best practice, which is going on, cutting edge, and you're doing some of that cutting edge work, as indeed is Jeremy Myerson. Our next speaker, Paul Priestman, is equally cutting edge, chairman of Priestman Good. Paul will tell us more about what he does, but I think it's important when we think about age-friendly housing and multi-generational environments to take proper stock of the need for people to be mobile. And this is a particular passion of Paul's. So hopefully you're there, Paul.
Yeah, I'm here. I don't know whether anyone can see me. I don't know how to take control of the screen.
Take control. Control is.
How's that?
You're there, loud and clear.
Great. Okay. Well, Ian, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. And I've really been enjoying everybody's really interesting and poignant points. I mean, when Ian started talking about the ISO and the standards for this area, I mean, I just immediately thought, what, there isn't one? I just thought it was amazing that there isn't one already. I mean, it's an area that we work within the whole time in transportation design. We're having to meet standards for things we're designing all of the time. But I'll come on to that in a second. Just to introduce myself, I'm Paul Priestman. I'm the chairman of a company called Priestman Good. We're based in London and offices in China and other parts of the world. And we specialize in transportation design, but also in the area of connectivity and people's lives. So this subject is very much part of one of our principles at Priestman Good. As I mentioned, I mean, because we work we design lots of high-speed trains, buses, trams, infrastructure stations. Standards are very much a part of our life as we're designing. And I think the standards do a number of things. One of them, it obviously picks up those companies that need help and guidance and almost push them into doing the right thing. but it also sets a benchmark. And that benchmark for the ones that want to really excel is to exceed in that area. So that's almost the baseline, and it's a prompt to push even further. And with the many companies we work with around the world, I do find it interesting that many of the standards, for instance, when you're designing a train for perhaps disability access, it's often seen as the minimal requirement. And there's no need to push any higher than that. So I think we have to be conscious when you set a standard that is the minimum rather than the maximum. And I think that is the role for a standard, because you can't predict the future, but you're just trying to pick up that almost the lowest common denominator will not happen. So I think that also what we're trying to do is to make things better. And if this standard could almost become a benchmark for living, and not necessarily for just one section of society, but for the whole of society. Inclusive design, I think, is something that has been mentioned a number of times, and Jeremy has just mentioned this. If we can actually expand to a larger audience, then it is going to be more inclusive in the way that people will buy into it and become more accepting. So I think as one is thinking about one section of society, if we can extend it and consider all sections of society, then we don't need to do special things for one area. So inclusive design, thinking about the society as a whole as you're designing, is very important. And that's what design's about. Design is not just about making something look beautiful. It's about understanding the problems, looking at the requirements, and then problem solving. The nice sort of styly bit at the end, that's a given. It's gonna look great. But what's important is making something better and solving problems. And that's where design is absolutely critical. And design isn't an add-on. Design has a place in all areas of products and initiatives. Design and creativity has value in finance. It has value in some of the less glamorous areas, as some people would say, because creative thinking and thinking out of problems is what design and creativity is all about. And my background is product design, so design for mass production. And I suppose the approach that gives myself and many of the designers at Brisbane Good is that we do fundamentally look at things. We don't accept what's there. We think about mass production. We think about how things can be really fundamentally redesigned. And as Ian mentioned, we've been working in many areas. And one of the projects which is interestingly almost coming through because of the current situation is a concept called walk lines, which I've been promoting for a number of years, which is basically encouraging walking as part of the public transport infrastructure. I call it's a bit like building a tram line with stations but no trams, so that people can walk between the stations, cycle between the stations, but it's a part of the public transport system. And it's very interesting to see what's happening in New York and London and Italy and now, where main high streets, main thoroughfares in cities are shut and closed and may remain closed because people are wanting to take different forms of transport. They don't want to be all bunched together in public transport. So I think this is some positive things coming out of the disastrous situation and horrific situation we're in the moment. But I think, maybe we can pull out some of those good points and make sure that they remain and they become part of society. Another project that we've been working with, and this again is with Jeremy and at the Design Museum in London, we were commissioned to look at mobility and the older population. And I've always thought that activity and health is all to do with mobility and getting out there and meeting and keeping healthy and enjoying life. And Scooters for Life, again, is very poignant right now, where it's a individual small scooter that you can live with for life. You can go shopping with it, you can take it into your home. It's safe, obviously, but also it's that individual form of transport. And it's thinking about the first and last mile, which is critical in cities, of how people travel from their home to a station or home to a shop without having to take joint public transport. So those sorts of things I think are, again, encouraging people to be sociable and active and mobile throughout their life. And again, you can see what's just happened in New York with the legislation of electric scooters and e-bikes. They're building fast cycle lanes. So, you know, some things are changing quite quickly because be required in their current state. So I think there's some exciting things happening at the moment. Obviously, some things which are affecting everything we do. But I think coming back to the ISO standard framework, I think it's immensely exciting, and I'll come back to my point at the beginning, saying, you know, surely this should have been done ages ago. I can't believe that we're talking about it now. But design is absolutely key to all of these aspects of the standard, because it's all to do with ideas, understanding, and problem solving. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Paul mentioned the tram, the tramless tramway, in fact. What do you call it again?
Walk lines.
Walk lines. It just so happened to have a picture of it here, which hopefully, can you see that?
Not at the moment. I can see a very nice view of the city.
No?
Not quite.
Okay, never mind. We do have a picture of it. I can see that's the cover. And now it disappears.
Amazing. You're going into in-screen mode.
Never mind. If you go to the Agile Aging website, you will be able to see a digital version of Neighbourhoods of the Future, and there's a double-page spread. I love the concept of a tramless tramway, where people actually meet. So this whole idea of multi-generational isn't about just sticking people in close proximity. It's actually creating the right kind of circumstance where actually they can casually
down the street and catching a bus to walk a mile or a kilometre, 2 kilometres, in a sort of a healthy environment, and you know, in perhaps a more enjoyable way. And what's the rush? You know, enjoy the moment. I think, yes, I think this is something that will come to stay. Yeah.
So you designed it as a concept. I mean, it was an idea. Are you looking for a client for it?
We're talking to cities, yes, we're talking to cities, but it's something we would like to help bring together. But I think there is a lot of discussion about what is happening to city streets and cities at the moment. You know, what is the future of the buildings that we have at the moment? Office buildings in central locations, shops in central locations. You know, are they going to have to be repurposed in some way? And how is the future city going to look? And again, that's I think it's positive in some respects, but a big change.
Fantastic. I particularly liked the benchmark for living. I thought that was really possibly the title for this event in hindsight. Please hang around. We'll have Q&As afterwards. We're now going to move to Paul McGarry, who's the Assistant Director of the Greater Manchester Ageing Hub. I think it's fair to say that of all the cities in the UK, Manchester is probably the most advanced when it comes to taking the interests of older adults on board, and Paul has been at the forefront of this change. So I'm really interested to hear the latest from what's going on in Manchester. Paul, I know you're there because I've seen you.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Can hear you, can't see you yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I see you.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. So I think, the first thing is just to explain a little bit about myself and work that we do. And then I wanted to maybe set some challenges for a standard like this. And if they can help with those challenges, it's a good thing, I think. So the first thing just to say is that I'm a part bureaucrat, so I worked in local government for over 25 years, the vast majority of that time around urban ageing policy and strategy, firstly for Manchester City Council, and in the last few years for Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which is the 10 Greater Manchester local authorities and the mayor. So I'm part bureaucrat, and my job is in part to take many of these fantastic ideas that flow around the system and try and get them to stick into policy and strategy. And that's not that's an interesting thing. It's not an easy thing. The second thing is I'm a sociologist, so I'm interested in people and societies and structures. And a lot of the discussions I think we have around ageing, particularly at the moment in terms of COVID, miss that dimension. I'll also work with WHO for many years, I think starting in around 2009-10. And one of the things that we did was set up a UK network of age-friendly cities, which is currently run by the Centre for Ageing Better, has 40 affiliates. And I work as a founding member of a Eurocities platform on urban ageing. We have around 30 or 40 cities. We're just about to publish a new document which brings together insights from Gothenburg and Amsterdam, Barcelona, Greater Manchester and others. And I'm currently in a location in Greater Manchester, which I think is a unique one in local government, where we bring together researchers, policymakers, older people themselves, increasingly businesses in our new platform that we're establishing, to try and serve the 2.8 million residents of Greater Manchester. All of them, hopefully, at some point will become old. I have to say, the whole of that experience that I've had has been hugely positive, but it's also underscored as well with a significant amount of frustration, I think, in terms of the ebbs and flows of policy and how policy is implemented and how it's led and how it's convened. And those are some of the things I just want us to all to think about. I also want to just make the case for local government in all this, because I think I'm possibly the only person from a kind of local government perspective in these discussions. GMCA and GMNHS spend £6 billion a year, upwards of £6 billion a year, which is a lot of money in housing, in transport, that actually excludes transport, and in many other things, in which design, the process of design and the output of design can play a good and a bad role. I also, it's worth, I think, reflecting on the structures in which design takes place. So I was sat in More or less this time last year with Andy Burnham, my mayor, I escorted him over to Helsinki, firstly to talk at a conference on the silver economy, but also to look at how Helsinki was dealing with homelessness. And we sat in a beautifully appointed mayor's office in Helsinki, as you might imagine. And Mayor of Helsinki said, well, we own most of the land. You know, we can do what we want, you know. And for the standard, you know, my mayor was kind of turning green with envy, I guess, because we work in an environment in the UK where many of the levers that are typically in place in other countries, some of which we've discussed today, are not present in the UK. So I think these are some of the challenges for an ISO. The first one, will it change the current dynamics in which we're working in the UK? So there's evidence of increasing spatial separation of generations. St Andrews University did a piece last year. And in essence, I think the market and the design of a market economy is pushing generations spatially further apart due to places like London and Manchester and so on. So we work in that context. I think also increasingly inequalities are now a routine element of our work. They're exaggerated by 10 years of austerity. And these aren't things that are easy to try and work around, I guess. They're absolutely at the centre of our understanding of ageing and of older people. And then you have this paradox, this ageing paradox, which is on the one hand, we have nationally and internationally ageing populations driving demand for new goods and services in some ways. On the other hand, we have multinational companies and organisations. Some of them are represented in these discussions, and it's difficult to see how these things are going to play out over the coming years and decades. And in the UK, one of the things that's kept us back is the lack of any kind of strategy around ageing since 2010. I have to say the work that our colleagues at UKRI on the ageing challenge is a welcome development. There are also, I think, increasingly a focus around ageing on the deficits of ageing. Our colleagues are already in this discussion, twice at least, I think, talked about the epidemic of loneliness. And actually, the data doesn't bear that out. You know, loneliness generally is at the same level across our societies over time and place. So we also need to think carefully about the language and the research from a sociological point of view on some of these things. I also think in terms of how our colleagues who work in development see these issues, I think they generally split the market into three sectors. There's the rich, who obviously will look after themselves, thank you very much. There's the poorest, or the poor third, who I think there's an expectation that the state will provide for them in one way or another. And then I think you have this middle income group, which I think is the focus of many developers, how they can take advantage of people who have capital and so on. And we have to integrate all these things into a strategy. Otherwise, as we're increasingly saying, different parts of our population will pull away from other parts. I also think inclusion and universal design are difficult concepts. I think a lot about tactile paving. Tactile paving is right across the world, everywhere we go, everywhere I've been anyway. Yet tactile paving is a huge problem for many older people, for many older women in particular, who end up slipping, falling and so on. So we have to be honest about the scope and sometimes the desirability of what we call inclusion. Okay, I've got to finish off on these points really. So in GM, I think our ambition through our local industrial strategy is for GM PLC, so jointly with central government, to establish an innovation partnership on healthy ageing, to establish an international centre of which design will be one part. And we're currently leading a bid with UKRI to establish a national design centre around ageing neighbourhoods and communities, along with a range of different partners. And the last point I just want to make as well is just about policy making and devolution, because I work for GMCA, so I'm paid to say this, frankly, and it's correct, which is, I think, still too much activity, too much policy making, too much investment is in the southeast and in and around London. All the big aging institutions are there, the design institutions are there. And while some colleagues, such as the Centre for Aging Better, are helping us in GM, we need to shift out and increase the process of devolution to different types of communities for this. So the last thing I will say is this, is that can a standard like this help us work and shift private partners who, for example, lobby against the lifetime home standards? Can it shift public sector behaviour, which is a million miles from the discussions that we're having, I think, at the moment? And can it help link our agenda to other agendas, such as the green agenda? And can it shift ageism as well? So if it can do a number of those things, then this is a fantastic opportunity. But I think, and I will finish with this, that we have to place central, local government and other types of public sector as a central part of these discussions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Paul. So I asked you to be provocative and box ticked. I would have expected no less, and much appreciated. Your comments in relation to universal design will fall very nicely on the ears of Paul Smith, who's going to be talking about that in a few minutes' time, and we will then get to the Q&A. But specifically now, a number of people have talked about density, and our next speaker, Esther Greenhouse, who's Strategic Director, Age-Friendly Centre for Excellence and Industries Scholar at Cornell Institute for Healthy Futures. I met Esther at the aforementioned event with AARP, which we co-produced in December, and Esther was moderating absolutely brilliantly, and I learned a lot about fit, environmental fit, that I didn't really have that much knowledge before, and that's primarily what Esther will talk to us about today. So Esther, say hi.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. I will.
Great. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. We've heard several terms, universal design, inclusive design, and a number of years ago, I started to use a term called enabling design because I wanted to put the focus on the purpose, and that is to leverage the power of the built environment to enable people to thrive. Okay. Do I have control of the slides? Okay, so and my professional purpose is to create a paradigm shift in our societies that understands the incredible magnitude of the impact of design on the way people function. And unfortunately, very few people are aware of the depth of this. So in order to create this paradigm shift, we have to start with the theory. And that comes from the work of Lawton and Nahimo and the environmental docility hypothesis. When you distill it to its essence, it's extremely simple and extremely powerful. And that's the concept of environmental fit and press. So environmental fit and press is about the relationship between a person and his or her environment, whether it's a product or a place. When we have good fit between a person and his or her environment, we can achieve independence. Unfortunately, when there's poor fit, it creates a stress to adapt. And that's what we refer to as environmental press. The demands of the built environment actually press down on a person's ability to function and pushes them to an artificially lower level. And what's crucial to understand is that this is occurring all the time. We can't wait until, let's say, an older person has a change in ability to make retrofits, because environmental press is working silently behind the scenes constantly. And we need to look at this through the lens of knowledge that the built environment is always impacting behavior, and it impacts no matter how well or how poorly it is designed. And what that signals is that all stakeholders which are involved in creating built environments, whether it's designers, architects, engineers, and so on, whether it is government officials, agencies, municipalities, investors, developers, they need to realize that they have a tremendous responsibility in the choices they make. But at the same time, we have this incredible opportunity. So building on theory, let's look at fact. And the fact is that the status quo of the built environment is not benign. We have not been designing and building for the past approximately 100 years or so in the U.S. and in most of industrialized societies, built environments that have a positive impact. They tend to have a negative or disabling impact. And one perspective that is crucial to understand is that much of our design conventions and anthropometric data we use is pretty much based on data for the average height male. We are often typically designing for the highest sensory abilities possible. So in effect, we're creating products and places which are ideal for the average height male between the ages of 20 and 40. And we're designing everybody else out. We're expecting them to adapt, we're forcing them to adapt, and we're subjecting them unnecessarily to environmental press. So when I discuss these concepts, sometimes I hear that, well, we have codes like we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, accessibility guidelines, and other building codes and standards. Unfortunately, what happens is that they've improved the built environment, but they haven't gone far enough. So here I was checking out this entrance to a healthcare facility that was built after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in the U.S. I entered the vestibule. I used a power assist button to open the exterior door, entered the vestibule, went to use the power assist button on the left of the photo to open the inner door, and found this. So the sign reads, "This button does not work for the inside door." And I could give an 8-hour presentation on barriers that we've created in the built environment. But moving along, this is a building that I assigned to my students at Cornell University to evaluate. It is to date the most expensive building built on campus. It was designed by a world-renowned architecture firm. And yet here is another example of a building that really disables human functioning. It is a challenge to how people can behave. And if you notice the low height guardrails in the center of the screen, those were added after construction because the designers had failed to consider that this major structural element could be a hazard for people walking into. But ignoring issues like the glare caused by the lights, the glare on the shiny floors, and so on. And I see it time and time again. This is a healthcare facility that opened last year, designed by an architecture firm with a lot of experience in healthcare environments, completely ignoring the fact that the vast majority of the users of this space are over 40 years old in terms of both patients and staff. And no consideration of the glare created by the LED lighting and the colors that were used in the environment. The reason I mention 40 years old is because past the age of 40, we are all experiencing normal, typical age-related changes to our visual functioning, and we need to design for that. So now we know what the issues are, now we know what the lens is. The solution now is enabling design. And what I'm advocating for is a 1-degree shift in design features to enable people to thrive. We know how to do this. We have had use of ramps for persons who cannot take steps, whether it's temporarily or permanently, for access with wheeled vehicles, whether it's a stroller or a transportation delivery cart or a shopping cart. We've been designing for this. We need to keep that in mind. Another thing is on the neighborhood level, bringing the large scale of a boulevard down to the human scale by a simple intervention like a pedestrian island crosswalk. And very importantly, in terms of residential housing, designing for the lifespan of users, but also designing for the lifespan of the house itself or the apartment itself, because in this particular example, this is what we call a flex space in the US. Its current purpose now is a den or a small living room, but it can function as a first floor bedroom. This needs to be standard. We can't go forward reinforcing the problems of our existing housing stock by repeating them over and over again. Simple things like lever door handles. So lastly, looking at action, the enabling design principle, which Stephanie Firestone mentioned earlier, with the focus to enable by design in terms of policy. And closing with this concept of why should you care? Well, when we have community features that don't need people's needs, this creates forced dependency and frailty. And that has significant costs, not only on quality of life, but lost assets. The current generation of older adults is the wealthiest generation. The coming generations have less money and are relying on the greatest wealth transfer in the U.S. case in particular in U.S. history. This also has an impact on services for municipalities. If we can provide enabling housing in neighborhoods, which enable people to thrive and be independent, we can limit the demand of services on our communities. And lastly, this is why I do it, so that my mother is not forced to move from her home, unlike her mother before her. So if you'd like to email me, I have an annotated list of hyperlinked resources, which I hope are of help to you. Thank you. Ian, I can't hear you.
No, I said under mute. Thank you very much, Esther. That was fantastic. There is much more where that came from, and I look forward to extending our dialogue in due course. I'm now going to switch to our final speaker in this particular session, Paul Smith, who's the Director of Foundations, because we've talked about new build, we've talked about the environment as it is, making the most of it, enabling design, we've talked about mobility. We haven't addressed is the critical nature of retrofitting, because in the UK and indeed in other parts of the world, the homes that people will be living in years to come have already been built. And so therefore, how do we go about addressing the need for accessibility, taking account of design? So Paul, can I turn over to you, please?
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Hello?
Can hear you very well, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, I'm Paul Smith. I'm from Foundations. We're the national body for home improvement agencies in England. which means we spend a lot of our time working with local authorities across England on home adaptations and disabled facilities grants. And I guess even though I'm speaking about retrofitting adaptations, I think it's at this point of the day it's quite difficult to say something that hasn't already been said, so I will do my best. And I've certainly heard lots of big ideas and big thinking, so I'm going to try something a little bit smaller. So many of you will probably recognise one of these, a fairly standard grab rail, and across kind of the public sector they cost around less than £1 to buy, but actually they cost probably around £25 to fit by the time you've travelled out there and fitted it. But because they're kind of cheap, I think they almost become a disposable item. Kind of people don't want them if they're no longer needed anymore. They just get removed and thrown away, and so it's another kind of £25 to go out and remove it. And then when somebody else needs it in the future, possibly after they've fallen, and it would have been really handy, then somebody else goes out to fit another one again. It's another £25. So it's lots of money involved, even though the grab rail itself is only 98p. And I think this tends to move us towards the idea that lots of this kit is kind of cheap, disposable, and not really there for the long term, and not really something that we should kind of build into the home as a standard feature. So, taking another example, maybe a toilet frame, which again are quite often provided through community equipment stores. But could one of these ever be seen as desirable, something that you want to keep in the long term? Certainly if it's a recycled or a second-hand one, how keen would you be to have that in your home? And certainly in terms of community equipment stores, although the idea is that lots of it is recycled, I think quite often it is just thrown away after it's been used, which then goes to why it's quite cheap to buy in the first place. So I think there is an upgrade on that, and there are quite a lot of examples of, I suppose, slightly more upgraded adaptations equipment. So you've got some chrome grab rails there, some kind of fold down rails and a seat. Certainly far less disposable, better quality in terms of the make of it. I think kind of the question is that more desirable, or how much more desirable is it? If you're kind of in your 40s, 50s, 60s now and are thinking of refurbishing your bathroom, if you don't need it now, would you fit that sort of stuff as a preventative measure? If you were looking at a new home to go and buy and you saw that in the bathroom, would you see that as a positive or a negative thing? And yeah, just kind of this direct, we need something to meet deficits. How desirable is that when you then have to kind of face your potential future? I think it's worth looking at telecare, which I think has had similar issues. That quite a while the market has been fairly stagnant in assistive technology, so certainly this type of telecare. Certainly the number of users hasn't grown significantly over the last few years, despite the demographics. Quite a lot of them are white or beige plastic boxes, but even if it's I suppose kind of a slightly more stylish black with chrome buttons, how much more attractive is that for somebody to use? And we're doing some research on disabled facilities grants a couple of years ago. We saw reports of people that had fallen, had the pendant, but still not used it because of the kind of the stigma associated with it, and kind of lay on the floor overnight with the pendant in the hand but not using it. So I think there's definitely something around the design of adaptations that we have at the moment that means that people don't engage with them and don't like them and don't want to use them. So is there potentially a different way of thinking about adaptations? And I quite like the way Amazon have approached things, probably not with this market in mind, but as an alternative, you could call Alexa and ask for help or ask for a range of assistance. They had the Mayday button with a nice Irish lady that you could ask all sorts of questions to. You can have Amazon services where you can find and rate all sorts of people to come visit your home and do odd jobs or potentially deliver care, and then they have the Amazon key. So rather than having the key safe on the outside of your house, with a simple code, you can unlock the front door for somebody you've booked through Amazon services and maybe through the Mayday button. So all of these things, I think, are very much aimed at the mainstream rather than a kind of a disability market. But the kind of thing that comes with it is that you also have access to music, videos, books, chat, calls, games, apps, automations, all aimed at the mainstream and all quite universal, but can be used by quite a range of people. Another thing you could do with it is potentially order food. So kind of looking at alternatives that you have, I guess, kind of traditional Meals on Wheels for kind of older disabled people. With your little polystyrene box, we have little choice of the meal, little choice on delivery time, and you heat it up in the microwave for perhaps £5 or £6 a time. But then you have all sorts of delivery services that, for not too much of a different cost, you can have food what you want, when you want it, and full control over the process. There was quite an interesting blog by, I think it was the one of the senior social workers of the Department of Health, talking about compassionate ageism and the belief that older adults are needy and deserve special policies to help them. I think perhaps Meals on Wheels is an example of that, where actually there are kind of more mainstream solutions that would work far better. So how does that apply to adaptations and equipment? I'm not saying these are necessarily the best designed products in the world, but they are equipment for the bathroom that also incorporates kind of a grab rail in some form or another, or something that you could grab hold of if you were feeling unsteady. And actually, because you wouldn't necessarily recognise them as a grab rail, you could have them there, leave them there, and not just if you're kind of older or had a disability, but if you're kind of feeling unwell, have a short illness, or just generally feeling unwell, there's something there that you could grab onto rather than slipping or falling in a shower or bath, for anybody of any age. And things like this, I think, are far more desirable than some of the standard equipment that we see fitted through disabled facilities grants at the moment. So this is a quite a nice wash basin. It also, you can see, has little grips in next to the basin there that you can hold on to. You could store stuff in, or you can even drape a towel through them, I think. So it's incorporating the different features into either furniture or fixtures or fittings that mean that they're useful for a wide range of people across a wide range of time. Bearing in mind, I think kind of somebody said earlier that houses are around for 100 years or so, actually something you can have fitted that all the inhabitants of that home over those years can use as well. So I think kind of the key for having a standard is that it would set out a new way of thinking that gets away from the kind of traditional approach of the cheap disposable adaptations that we often see at the moment, that aren't designed specifically to counter the, I suppose, kind of the negative aspects of older age or disability, but are kind of designed for all, designed for the long term, designed to make life easier, and designed to make life more joyful as well. If we can incorporate all those into a standard, I think that'd be a job well done.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Seems to me that the direction of travel here is that we're really saying that if a standard is aspirational and enabling, which is kind of unusual, not what you would necessarily expect, but rather that than being something that people have to do, it's something that's forced upon industry, can make a huge difference. And the sense here is there is actually a desire to define what is good, what good looks like, and collectively across the board. It also brings to mind, in specific regard to what Paul was just talking about, who's going to pay? I mean, Paul, you talked about a fair number of products and services in there. You are engaged with advising local government, and it's a lot of your day-to-day. Somebody asked a question, will there be a demand from local government for such a standard? So, you know, maybe there's a nominal additional cost for some of those things that you displayed, who's going to pay?
I think it's looking at, as somebody said earlier, it's the price against the value. We could fit grab rails 10, 20 times, but actually if we fit a good one once, then that would actually be far cheaper at the end of the day. Similarly with all sorts of adaptations, certainly in housing association properties, quite often thousands of pounds are spent adapting a bathroom, but as soon as that person moves out, then it's ripped out and the bath's replaced. And maybe 5 or 10 years later, the shower's put back in again. So actually, if you take a longer-term approach and design something that's fit for a longer period of time, then actually the value increases significantly.
Fair enough. I would like to bring Alberto into the conversation because he responded with great enthusiasm to Paul's idea of the tramway and said it's something similar going on in Madrid. Milan, sorry. Paul. Alberto.
Yes, indeed. I think, as I said at the beginning, mobility is a key aspect for helping a neighborhood to be lively. Because people have to move inside and to move outside of it and reach it. And indeed, in my presentation, I was speaking about a European project, STEAM. It's an Horizon project we are a partner of that is creating an environment in which not only electrical vehicle, but multimodal, on-demand mobility as a service, so it is on-demand and personalized, is going to be tested, is in fact tested in several areas of Europe. Not only in Italy, also in Austria and other places. So this European project is exactly addressing that. And by the way, this infrastructure that has been designed to enable mobility from a green perspective now is exactly enabling personal mobility from a COVID perspective. Because if you can personalize and request on-demand services, you can request this because you like it, because you want to save the environment, or because in a COVID situation you want to have alternative way to move. That's why mobility and considering mobility as a service and integrating this platform in neighborhood and in connecting neighborhood is a strategic point. And I think this is a low-hanging fruit for standardization, because anyway we are redesigning the built environment to create bicycle ways, to create place where you can recharge your electric vehicles, bring them motorcycle, build their car. All is happening. All is already standardized in functional terms. And even you see the standard in mobility by domain as a way to be interoperable and to sell worldwide. I think that this fit is very strategic for the moment. And so I really go for a dedicated effort on mobility, taking the moment that is a tripod moment for this. And I would like to add a more other aspect to what is being said. It is not related to mobility, it is related to the discussion on how to make it happen in general. I believe that as government give incentives to transform the environment in order to pursue greener behaviors or better protection of the built environment against dispersion of heat and electricity and so on and so forth, another way to consider how to make this standard making value for government and individuals is to make some policy, let's say, that incentive for all of this adaptation to be paid back by tax incentives. So you can transform, helping transform the built environment, you can give advantages to the new environment, and you are pushing this thanks to incentives, and more taxes will come in the end of the government, which is basically the only thing that they are interested in.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you there because there's 2 points that you've made which I'd like to spread around. I'm going to come to you in a second, Esther, but I want you to think about something that we were discussing a couple of weeks ago, which is cost-benefit analysis. because what Alberto was just referring to, if you can define a return on investment, then actually you start to stack up the argument. So could you give some thought to picking up on that, because it was really interesting what we've been talking about. But first of all, I just want to go to Paul McGarry, and not in the first instance talk about you, Paul, rather than to you. Specifically, Manchester. We've got 3 Pauls on this one, my goodness.
Yeah,
Pool of Pauls. But Paul McGarry, in terms of the Manchester hat I'd like you to wear, what do you think about this idea, for example, of a tramway? Going back to this notion of mobility, they're thinking about it in Milan. Manchester, you know, it is, to my mind, an innovative space. They try things. It's communal. There's a lot of people walking around. I mean, is there anything that you could think of which could be pioneering? I mean, possibly even this walkway that this tramway that Paul is thinking about. Thoughts? Paul McGarry, I'm asking you. Or you broke. He's frozen. Is he? Are you able to speak? Because there's a picture of you. No. Okay. Should we actually look at another city? Maybe Tama. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the idea of creating places for people to walk is fantastic. And, you know, our cities have been overrun with cars. And how do we really look at the transformation of autonomous vehicles and how they can provide more place for people walking, people on scooters, people on bikes. And we're beginning to see some of this transformation here. But because of so much of our reliance on cars and cars that we each individually own, looking at how this sharing economy is happening and how the autonomous vehicles have a possibility of engaging and creating greener environments like many of the panelists have spoken of today.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any comments on the mobility issue that was promoted by Alberto and Paul earlier? In which case, can I come back to you, Esther, with regard to the cost-benefit analysis?
Absolutely. So I am motivated to do this work and make this change because I believe in it, but we have to look at the bottom line. What do things cost? So I'll give you 3 examples, 3 different levels of society that are impacted by enabling design. So the first is an older adult themselves. In the U.S., using bidet seats or bidets is not culturally acceptable. My mother, who happens to be from Europe, insisted on having this as a feature in her home. And purchasing and installing this 9 years ago for under $1,000 US, I estimate has saved her over the course of 9 years approximately $30,000 in home health aid services. Not to mention that she has never once had a urinary tract infection, and it also gives her dignity and a sense of well-being. Now, the other important aspect to think about with enabling design features is the impact, for example, on me as the adult caregiver. The more that I have to assist her, the more my mother is dependent on me, the more time I take away from the workforce, which has a negative impact on our economy, which we tend not to measure or we underplay. And again, in terms of society, when our municipalities and our state governments have really taken such a hit with COVID, this was an issue beforehand, but it's really exacerbated now. It's crucial that we make sure that our population is as healthy and independent as possible, because the coming waves of older adults don't have the financial resources to move to skilled nursing facilities and assisted living, and not even enough money for home health aides. So we are going to have increasing numbers of older adults who are dependent on government services to provide that, and government funding. We can't afford it now, and we won't be able to afford it in the future. So a very simple approach is to utilize the design to minimize the existing environmental press.
Thank you for that. We're going to move on, but there are two hands. Tama and Paul has come back. Hopefully he can tell us, because actually they are organising something along similar lines of the tramless tramway. So Paul, can you see if you can actually move at this point and speak, because you're frozen on my screen anyway. Go for it. No. Okay, Tama, please.
I'm lucky I have access to voice.
Yes.
A couple things.
Good to see you.
Great. A couple things. One, I was thinking a lot about, as all of us are talking about the stigma around aging, we don't want to create a stigma around these ISO standards. And, you know, Esther, you're talking about environmental fit and not environmental press. And I really seek that these ISO standards are the environmental fit part and not the environmental press. I think that we are challenged to have the passion that everyone has on this panel engage in designing and looking at our aging population in a positive way and, you know, in a sexy way, which doesn't always exist, and inspiring and providing ways that, you know, we can not only limit to the ISO standards, but really enlighten and inspire people to go beyond what we see as the current standards.
Thank you, Tama. I'm going to read what Paul said, because he's having broadband issues, which is we have a program called B-Lines, led by Chris Boardman, significant investment in walking and cycling. We'll see if we can find out more and share it. We are running behind again by 15-20 minutes, so I am going to have to wrap up this particular session. I wish to thank each and every one of you, and on the preceding session, which I didn't actually thank everybody, it's absolutely superb. I mean, we could go on forever, but I truly appreciate what you've had to say. Hopefully you will hang around, because the next sessions are equally compelling, especially Paul Quinn, who's coming up next, because he's practicing what you guys are preaching, and he's using a lot of money in the process. So I think that is incredible. I've really enjoyed spending time with Paul Quinn over the past year or so, and looking forward to hearing about his projects.